webinar. Good evening, everyone. This is Dawn. I'm ASQ Toronto Section Secretary. I will be the moderator of this webinar. On behalf of ASQ Toronto Section, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar and invite you to join us for online learning opportunities via ASQ Toronto Section free webinars. Please note that this webinar is recorded and the recording will be available on ASQ Toronto Section website as well as ASQ Toronto YouTube channel. There will be 5 to 10 minutes time after the presentation for questions and answers. Please post your questions on the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. You will be given 0.1 RU recertification unit for attending this webinar if you attend at least 40 minutes, as well as filling out the survey. The survey will be sent to you after the webinar session. The topic of tonight's webinar is Sustaining Change, Busting Change Management Myths. As quality professionals, we are often called upon to implement change, whether it is a design, measure, analyze, improve, control project, or a corporate initiative. We need to understand the dynamics of change to assist in achieving improvement and strategic goals. Sustaining change is elusive. Are we to be guided by common change management myths? The learning objectives are gain insights on 5 elements for sustaining change, bust the myths associated with those elements, take away some practical approaches to help you achieve and sustain change. I'd like to welcome our presenter and our speaker, Wanda Storm. Thank you very much, Wanda, for dedicating your time and to accepting to be our speaker tonight. Wanda Storm is a progressive leader with 30 years of experience across the energy, financial, and high-tech sectors. She has an MBA, is a Master Black Belt, holds certificates in change management, coaching, system thinking, and performance management. Wanda serves on the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award Board of Examiners 2008-2010, is the immediate past chair of ASQ Human Development and Leadership Division, and currently the facilitator for the Technical Communities Group 2. She is currently employed as a consultant in the energy sector. Now I'd like to hand over to Wanda Storm. Wanda, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with the Toronto section. I would like to also extend a thank you to the leadership of the section for allowing this opportunity. I hope that each person that is participating in this can either take away one new learning. If it's not a new learning, hopefully you'll find a reinforcement for something that you thought you already knew. Or maybe it will be a reminder for you of something that maybe you knew in the past but haven't had to apply lately. All of it around sustaining change. You would think that by this point in life, we would no longer have to talk about change management. You would think that everyone would realize there is a people component to all changes that take place, not only in the workplace, but changes also take place in our everyday lives. There's a few examples that are listed on this slide, and maybe you have noticed additional complexity in the workplace where you are. I know that as things continue to change, there are seemingly different levels of complexity, and although we keep focusing on trying to keep things simple, sometimes complexity creeps in. The actual pace of change with the advancement of technology is one feature that, it's outdated before you ever really fully integrate it into the activity that you're doing. Innovation, I know, is a focus for many companies, and it's a specific focus for the companies that I interact with and also for the organizations of which I am a part, like ASQ. There is always the need to improve our processes, and with each process improvement comes a change in behavior that's required by those executing the process. in terms of breadth of networks, you know, I find myself, and I don't know if you find yourself, in more and more networks. As social media continues to grow and expand, and there's different applications which we can be involved with, there's also different groups with which we can be involved with. So I'm sure that you're finding yourself, as I do, in more and more networks over time, so that you're spreading yourself across networks. But the thing about this is I want you to realize, hey, there's no real reason to be dismayed, because we can actually move forward with this type of change that we're experiencing. As quality professionals, you have exactly what it takes. You have the right qualities to manage and to lead change. You know, a few of those qualities, and they're listed here, but I want to just point out that systems thinking, when you can begin to look at the cause and effect and the impact that processes have on each other, and being able to step back and look at those interactions, you know, begin to look at the impacts to make sure that the change won't create conflicting focus areas. I think that's critically important. As we look at making changes, I know in a lot of the work I do, we're changing processes, and in that change of the process, we also have a supporting digital tool. Many times, if you step back and look at it from a system perspective, does that need to integrate with other processes and tools that are already out there? Is there a way to make sure that we're not asking people to do rework or asking people to do the same work twice? We really need to consider that and look at it from an overall system perspective to make sure that we're understanding that complete cause and effect, that if I change this in this place, it's going to have this effect in this other location. You also have to have group facilitation skills, which I know most people as quality professionals actually already possess this. These are critical to enabling others to become aware, to understand, to adopt, and finally to get to that point of internalization of the change that's actually taking place. You can effectively guide others to navigate the change. So I think those group facilitation skills that you have come into play very strongly, especially when you're working with teams and you're trying to help teams realize the importance of the change that's taking place. Those group facilitation skills, getting people involved. I know I was just recently on location working with a group, and one of the things that we did is we actually had the process mapped out for them already, but we were working through, you know, what else happens? What are your inputs and your outputs for this particular step in the process? Do you understand what could be done differently with this? And by having that facilitation of that group, have that conversation, they were able to come up with ideas to make improvements and to think about why it was important to make the changes that we were suggesting. And then they even actually came up with some additional changes that could be made. The other thing that you have to be able to do, and that you actually have the ability already in your pocket as a quality professional, is the ability to discern the intended from the unintended consequences. So if you go back and you look at and think about systems thinking, skill, and insight, you can begin to identify any potential unintended consequences, and you can determine whether they're actually helping you or they're hindering you for the change that's being put into place. By being able to step back, you are seeing the bigger picture, and you understand not only what is desired, but what other fallout there may actually be. So let me share an example with you. So one of the projects I'm working on focuses on a change in the workforce management process for projects, and it also has a supporting tool that we use. And so one of the things is stepping back and looking at how does this impact the overall system. And when you're thinking about large projects, how does managing the workforce really impact other aspects of the project. So in this particular project, and thinking about it in terms of the overall system, what we're looking at is when you're planning for different phases of your project, do you have the right resources? Do you have the right resources in place and on time with the right skills to be able to execute what needs to happen? As you look at that, you're also looking at how are we going to get groups of people who are responsible for managing the workforce information and data on a project to understand that we need to do things a bit differently and we need some more structure and to be more standardized in what we're doing so that we can benchmark across projects and be able to look at what is happening in one phase of a project and then apply those best practices to another project in that same phase. The other thing is, what are some of the intended and unintended consequences? As we're looking across this, we're discovering that projects are different. And you all know that, and everybody, you know, anytime you want to implement a change, people will say something about, well, that's great, but it doesn't really apply to me because we're different. Well, in this particular project, each of the projects are different, but that doesn't mean that we can't standardize on some of the aspects. So some of the intended consequences is that we get some standardization. Some of the unintended consequences from a positive standpoint is that not only do we have some standards in place, but it makes it easier and it takes less time for people to actually execute the work and looking across the different fields that need to be populated for a particular workforce person. And so as you're doing this, we're having some unintended consequences which are actually positive in improving the efficiencies of the group as well. So if you think about that, think about a project that you're working on. Can you step back and look at it from a system perspective? Are there other aspects that integrate with it? Are there groups that you're trying to work with that you can help them to understand the change better and become more familiar with the specific changes that are taking place? And then are you able to identify some of those intended and the unintended consequences associated with the change that's taking place? So, you know, as a quality professional, you really have all of this. You do this in your day-to-day work. You just may not realize that that's what you're doing. So take a conscious effort of looking at it from that perspective. Another thing that we do as quality professionals is that we regularly collaborate. This skill is effectively displayed by quality professionals across the world, the whole concept of collaboration. So for change to be effective, there needs to be thought given to who makes up those involved in executing the change and ensure that they are representative of the change landscape. Some of those people may be the actual workers. Those people are your technical experts. You may also have facilitators or managers associated or impacted by the change. You need to have creative people to assist with communication, with engagement, and helping change to stick. And very importantly, you also need the strategic specialist or executive who will sponsor the change in the organization. So to be successful with change, you need to collaborate with all types of these people on your project and make sure that you cover and have a good change team pulled together that is made up of people who actually understand the specific work, the creative people who can help you dream up new ideas, the facilitators or the managers of the processes, and the executives who are your sponsors. So that collaboration is another key skill that you as a quality professional already have, and this is how you put it into place for a successful change team. The thing about it is that change can lead to a lot of different things. So even though we have all those resources in place, and even though you may have a well-developed change plan, Change can still lead to anxiety. And those of us that are focused on change as our key roles, one thing about us is we're good at helping to manage change or lead change. But we know more than anyone else like to have change, quote, done to us, unquote. So it's important to remember that. And be sure to look at the change through your eyes as a change professional. Are you providing appropriate and intentional communications? Ask yourself, are you working to reduce conflicts and confusion? Can you connect the why of this change to the future? Each of these questions that I just asked you, are you providing appropriate and intentional communications? Are you working to reduce conflicts and confusion? Can you connect the why of this change to the future? All of these are critical as you embark on your change journey. And one thing to remember about change, it is a journey. It is not an event. I would like to say that you would like to come in and say, okay, we're going to change this. This is today. Tomorrow it's going to be implemented. Everybody's going to love it. It'll be done. But it doesn't work that way, because change that we're talking about here is not managing a change to your project schedule, your project cost, or what you're actually doing on your project. It's more about the behavioral change of people that are impacted with the change that's taking place based on what you're doing. So why in the world is change not effective? What would keep it from being effective? We've just talked about all these great skills and things that we have. We've talked about how we can look at it. But in the words of John Cotter, who is one of the experts in organizational change, he indicates that our change is ineffective because we allow complacency. We don't bring the right people together. So if you think back to the team we were supposed to have just a few slides ago, right? We're supposed to have experts. We're supposed to have creative types. We're supposed to have facilitators. We're supposed to have sponsors. If we don't have the right people pulled together to guide the change and ensure there is a vision and remember that connection to the future, then it's going to be extremely difficult for the change to be effective. Under-communicating is always a possibility. So you need to remember the adage, and I'm sure each of you have heard it before, but it's communicate, 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 and communicate some more. Be sure to claim the short-term wins. I mean, this is important when you're looking at seeing a benefit from the change. So to see any type of benefit is excellent. So noting what that change, what that win is, makes a difference. Making sure that you identify and remove barriers and obstacles. You know, as a change person, that's one of the key things that you need to do is identify what barriers stand in the way. As you look at your key stakeholders, one of the things you want to identify is what stands in the way of them being able to accept this change and being able to implement it. And the other thing that you never want to do is you never declare victory after an initial win. And that's because you just don't want to do it too soon. If you declare victory after one person is excited about the change and talks about it and represents it the way that you want it, but you don't get the rest of the folks, then it is going to be not as successful as you would like. You want to be sure that it's going to cross over into all the impacted parties before you go out and declare a victory. An example of this is, you know, one way to talk about it is a lot of times we'll do pilots. And once we do a pilot, we'll declare victory. Well, it is the pilot is a win if it goes well. And it's a short-term one, though, that needs to be celebrated. But you don't forego all that you did to get there for that particular win for the next set of implementations. This project that I told you about a few minutes ago, we're doing, we have what we call early adopters of the process and tool, and so we're taking it out to people, and We've got 3 of those before the end of the year this year. So it'd be real easy to declare victory if we get this out and they start using it. But what we really need to do is use the learnings from those particular implementations, carry that forward in the next implementations, and make sure that it's covered across all of the projects that we're working with to ensure that they understand the change and can fully implement it. On the team, many times we forget that we are so entrenched with the change and we do not consider it as something new for the next recipient. I know one time I was coaching with the executives in a company and we were going through an organizational change. And at first, when I went to meet with him about some of the things that were going on, he was like, well, I can't answer that question. I can't answer that question because I don't know yet what my role is going to be. And I said, well, that's how everyone else is feeling. So that's how we need to communicate with folks, is to let them know that even though you don't know what your next role is going to be, here are some things you can be doing in the interim. It was very interesting because about 6 weeks later, I met with the same manager again, and he had been told what he was going to be doing, and his whole attitude had changed. And he was like, people just need to get on board. They need to get on board with this. And I was like, do you remember the conversation we had 6 weeks ago where you were in the same boat as everyone else and didn't really know where you were going, and you were not willing to talk about these changes? So it was a very enriching coaching discussion, but also it really focused on the change aspect and the personal changes that people need to go through when you're having an organizational change. A big area for change is really understanding the culture in which you are implementing the change. And so that I cannot stress enough, because every organization, sometimes every sub-organization within a large organization has a different culture. Sometimes teams have their own culture. So you need to make sure that you anchor whatever the change is in the culture for that particular group that's actually having to go through the change. So I want us to look at, this has been like an introduction to where we're going with this, but I'd like to look at 5 elements to sustain change. And as we prepared this workshop, there were 2 of my colleagues and I worked on preparing this for WCQI last year. And as we looked into creating from this, the webinar material, we have discovered many similarities among the change gurus that are out there. And while there are other commonalities besides these 5, we found these 5, in our experience, to be absolutely critical for all types of changes, whether they're organizational or individual or anywhere in between. So let's take a look at the 5 elements to sustain change. So you have where you are now, and you want to get to a point of sustained change. And so to do that, you need clear direction, planning and communication, sponsorship, install and realize, and reinforcement. The first element, clear direction. Where is it that you really want to go? What is the vision? Can you succinctly describe that? Have you really spent the time to create a vision statement that can be effectively communicated? Those are some things that you need to look at. That brings us to the second element of planning and communication. Planning and communication is to make sure that you have in place a change plan and communication to support that change plan. So in your change plan, you want to make sure that you're understanding who your stakeholders are, what's really changing for them, how is that going to impact them, how are you going to communicate it to them, and how are they going to be able to move through the change life cycle to get to a point of internalization. You have sponsorship. To me, and I think to my colleagues as well, as we talked about this, and in benchmarking information across organizations and industries, Sponsorship is the most critical element to sustaining change. If you do not have good leadership support, if you do not have some drive from your senior leaders, I can tell you that many times change will fail. Not always. Sometimes from a grassroots level you can get some things to stick, but in order for, especially for an organizational change to be sustained, you're going to need critical and key sponsorship. Install and realize. And the difference here, and we're going to talk about it more in terms of the myth that surrounds it, is the installation is about the introduction of the change, so it's telling you that something's going to change. Realization is really about achieving the goal, so we'll look at an example for that in a little bit. And then reinforcement, it comes in many different forms, and we'll talk about how critical reinforcement of the desired behaviors are to actually sustain change. So associated with each one of those are myths. So the change myth that we would like to address in this session is vision, goals, and intent are static. You only need change plans for big changes. You need charismatic leaders. They are what's key. Change planning ends when the change is actually solved, and change is hard. So we want to walk through these 5 myths and share with you some ways to overcome those and as you work with change. And we're going to start out with the vision, goals, and intent are static. And the whole point of it is not hardly. You know, change is not static. Change plans are going to have to adjust as the project adjusts. I've listed only 3 possible examples here, and there's a whole lot more. But I can share with you a specific example that happened to one of the projects I worked on, and that was a change in sponsorship. Now, I can talk about this here, and I can also talk about it when we get to the sponsorship aspect. But it's very interesting, the impact that sponsorship actually has on the change. So in this particular instance, we had a change in sponsorship for the workforce management project I was working on. And so it was interesting when the sponsor that we had was moving out and the new one was moving in. There was also a decision to make a change in the terms of the approach that we were using for the project. So for the tool part of the project, we decided to use an agile approach versus using a waterfall approach. And what happened is when the new sponsor came in, they immediately took the plan, moved it forward, and it was an excellent change in sponsorship. So it was a great example of a positive that can happen when your sponsors are on the same page and they want to move the project forward in the same way. The impact of the change, the different approach to project completion, the different approach to stakeholder engagement, all those things could have been a deterrent. But what happened is we had those elements in place. We had the sustained change elements, clear vision, planning and communication, the sponsorship, the installation and realization, and reinforcement. Those may all have to be adjusted, but for us in that particular project, the change in sponsorship did not have a negative impact on the project, and the project is continuing to move forward and move forward at a steady rate and a rate that we'd like for it to. So, impacts can be significant or minor, but whatever those impacts are, you're going to need adjustments to your change plan. So even though we had a change in sponsorship, we did have to change our communication plan because the way that the sponsors communicated was different and the approach that we took was going to be different, so that made the communication have to be different as well for the project. So you can see that as you have changes to your project or your initiative, then you will want to make sure that you update your change plan associated with it. So the thing about it is, here are some things that may change. So in your change plans, you may change what deliverables you're going to deliver by phase. You're going to have ongoing updates that you provide for your sponsor plan, your stakeholder engagement, your communication, and then making sure that you're ready. You want to do the readiness assessments at the right time to make sure that the project's ready to move forward and they're good with, from a change standpoint. From a communication standpoint, they should always be revisited to make sure that you are clear in the purpose, it's aligned with the vision, make sure the specific content you were trying to get across is understood, be clear in who is your audience, and then make sure you target that communication to the audience, because it's not going to be the same for everyone. Figure out what media will you use, how are you going to deliver it, and how are you going to get feedback. So that's the key things that you can consider for myth number 1. So let's move to myth number 2. Myth number 2 is change plans are only for the big change. So regardless of the size of the project or the type of change, it's important to have a plan to assist with that change. And your plan doesn't have to be the same for every project. It doesn't have to be as detailed. It doesn't have to include as much information. But what you need to do is determine if your change is actually transformational. So one of the things I'd ask you is why you still need to use change tools if the change is not transformational. But since I can't ask you that directly, what I'm hoping is that you're going to be thinking about things like you're asking people to do something different than they currently do. It may be a small change, but think through, how are you going to communicate that? How are you going to engage people to make sure they have clarity? And how are they going to share knowledge about the change? All of that's going to be critical to the success. And I'm sure you can think of other reasons than these things, but these are some of the things that you can think about in terms of it. Regardless of the size of the change, you need to make sure that you're looking at these different facets. So we have a simple tool that I'm going to show you that will help you determine the level of your change. And it's included in here, and it's just a scale from the left to the right, from non-transformative to transformative. And what you would do is you would just select the square that indicates where your change effort is. So for example, if it's an improvement on a current tool, process, approach, or is it really a new total design? Is it something brand new that's coming out? So if you look at is it a single solution, or is it different solutions possible? Is it process focused, or is it customer focused? You know, the scope is an important thing. So if it has a very narrow scope, it's focused on one process, one department, one division, then it may not be so transformative. But if you're looking cross-functional or cross-divisions, it's going to be much wider in scope. It's going to touch a bunch of different types of people, and so you're going to need to consider that. So what you would do is you would select on here where you think you are, closer to the left or closer to the right for each of the items. And then once you do that, you would kind of do an assessment of how transformative is this change really. And then if it's closer to non-transformative, then you would probably use less tools and less specifics associated with the change, but you would want to have a change plan, a communication plan, and a stakeholder plan at a minimum. But if it's transformative, you're going to look at it further than that. You're going to want to look at behavioral analysis. You're going to want to look at other aspects of change that are critical to make a transformative change take place and be successful. So let's move forward and look at myth 3. So myth 3 is that charismatic leaders are key. Well, I can tell you this, that a responsible sponsor is going to beat a charismatic sponsor at any time. The responsible sponsor will stay the course over the lifespan of the change initiative, and this is critical because they have an investment in it. They invest resources of time, energy, money, and other types of resources. They are looking at consistently pursuing the goal, even under stress and over time. You know, we were talking earlier about the short-term win. They'll reject the short-term benefits that are inconsistent with overall strategy for the goal achievement. They're going to stand fast in the face of adversity, and they're going to creatively resolve problems or issues that would block the achievement. So one example here when I think about it is that Jack Welch was CEO at GE when I worked there. And, you know, some people disagree with his method of leadership and others applaud it. I was one that actually applauded it, and I loved working there when he was there. I was very clear on what my goals and objectives were, what I was being measured on, what I needed to do to be successful there as a Six Sigma Master Black Belt in the organization that I was in. And as the leader for that in the organization, I felt very comfortable that as long as I did my job, I got the results that were expected, and I got it using the right tools and way that I should, I would be successful and GE would be successful. It was very interesting to actually meet him in person, and I think that he was charismatic in a lot of ways, but specifically when he met you, he looked you directly in the eye, he shook your hand, and he talked to you about the job that you were doing. And he had a great knowledge of what all was going on in the corporation. And so to me, whereas he had some charisma, he was extremely responsible in making sure that we had the right resources to help us execute our projects in our business where I was working, and to make sure that we could deliver on the goals that were set for us by the corporation. The other thing, other than responsible, is engaged beats charismatic. So an engaged sponsor is the most critical success factor for a change initiative. That person is a true sponsor with you. They're very clear about the success. They get together with you. They expect the good and bad news, and then they help mitigate anything that comes up. And they participate in risk evaluation and updates, and they are actually the face of the communication. I'd have to say that engagement by the sponsor is key to success. So I have another example that did not work so well. We had a sponsor for a particular project, and that sponsor retired. The person that came in and took their place had a very different idea about the approach with the project that I was working on and the change aspects of it. And so he was potentially, for the most part, unavailable to work anything with me as the change leader for the project. He decided that the project did not need to go through the phases as we had set the project up, and we needed to reduce the communication out to the stakeholders, and that we needed to have a different setup in terms of how we were going to execute the project going forward. All that was put in place, and so our communication, we had been doing monthly communications to our stakeholders, and that stopped like cold turkey. And then you would start receiving questions, and then you would have to respond with, well, like, I can't, I don't have an update, I don't know where we are. It was extremely difficult to deal in that particular situation. So having a sponsor that is disengaged and having a sponsor that is not on the same page with the project about what success looks like can be very damaging. So it has taken quite a while for that project to come back around. And we actually now have some additional and different sponsorship that's helping the project move forward. And we actually had our first implementation last week. And so I'm happy to say that just because one sponsor, you know, ditches on a project, so to speak, does not mean that it cannot come back around and be successful in the long term if it's something that's good for the company and good for those who would be impacted by it. And so I say that to say keep on keeping on. You know, whether you've got a charismatic sponsor or leader does not matter so much as long as you've got someone that's responsible and someone that is engaged. So I have two examples of where, you know, one of those was great engagement, great sponsorship, and the other, and responsible, and the other not so much. So you want to be sure and try to mitigate those circumstances as best you can, and sometimes the best thing is just time to be able to make that happen. So myth number 4, this is where we talk about the change plan ends when the change is installed. And so installation means putting something new in place. So this is when you first introduce the change. So for example, we're implementing a change. We're going to, for an easy example, we're going to implement a new application or digital tool. And so the easy thing to do is to send out some videos and provide some training and hand off some templates and say, okay, yep, the change is in place. But, you know, actually the change is not in place just with that. And this really comes from Daryl Connor's work, and it is a critical concept. The thing about it is the myth that it ends when the change is installed, it is truly a myth because that change does not last. You know, if people can go back to the way they were doing things before, typically they will. So getting to that point of realization is when the purpose for the change is actually achieved. And that means that you're actually achieving some of the goals that were set out for why you were doing the project in the first place. So it's great that you do training. You do have to do that part. But then if that training yields revenue expectations, then that's much better. If training people on a new tool helps them learn how to do it, that's great. If they go back to the old tool that they used to use or a spreadsheet or something, then that means it didn't become realized. When it's realized, it's when that becomes the way they work and they realize the efficiencies and the effectiveness that they actually have based on putting that in place. So here's something to kind of help you. It's a change risk checklist, and this comes from Connor's work. And so for the gray box area, you would like to have green. You would like for those to be low because the level of resistance you want low and the level of change saturation you would like low. However, you would like effective sponsorship, that you've got all the data that you need, the culture is aligned, and the team manages the connections, and you want those to be high. This is a great thing to sit down and talk with your sponsor about, and so you can take this check sheet in with you during a sponsor meeting and talk to them about the specific change risk that's going on with your project. And so I think it's a great way to sit down with your sponsor and say, you know, are we comfortable that we've got the right level of leadership in place and that it's being effective? You know, are we clear? Do we have all the data that we need to make the decisions regarding the change? You know, based on our culture that we have, is the way that we're approaching this change seemingly working? And then how do you feel about the team managing the connections among the portfolio of the project? How do you see things aligning? Are things really aligned in the business so that what we're working on is really helping other things progress as well? And then, you know, are you seeing any resistance? This is what I'm seeing. So that's a great conversation to have. And then, you know, is there a lot of change going on? Is there too much? Do you need to back off of it for a little bit? how can you actually address that if there's too much change taking place, if there's too much change saturation? So these are good points to discuss with your sponsor to make sure that you're moving forward and that you can get to that point where you have realization versus just installation. All right, so we got about 5 minutes before we go to our Q&A. So myth 5, why change is not hard. So there was a HBR, Harvard Business Review article that talked about this, and we can sometimes make change hard by the words that we actually use. And so the concept of this is to try and turn that around and say what we have helping us make the change. What have we done before well that we can recreate with this change? And so this is just a way to look at change from a positive perspective and have it not be so difficult. So what do you have going for you? Try to list out some of those things. What forces are helping you with a change? And then what change has your group gone through successfully? If you can identify those particular things, then you can look at, okay, so this change that we're suggesting, what we're working on next, then what does that have in common with the other changes that the group has been through? The other thing that you can do is you can write this positive elevator speech or about the change process. And so you would want to say something about the change, and you would want to make it simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, and emotional. So this little tool can help you actually write that. So I wrote one as an example that I'd like to share with you, and that is that we are enabling you to have better quality data at your fingertips in one place. In addition, you will be able to see a diagram and graphs that display the data. This change will enable you to make better and quicker decisions because you're not having to search for important data. We realize how frustrating it is not to have the needed information timely and accurately, and are working to eliminate that frustration. So with that, as an elevator speech, it talks about why the change is positive that's going on. And so if you spend the time to just write a quick, positive elevator speech, that would be very helpful for you and with others to be able to communicate about the change that's taking place. And I kind of want to wrap up here with just some lessons learned. Benchmarking studies indicate there are several key lessons. Planning, sponsorship, integrating change early in the project, and educating the team and others on change are all critical. So whereas we didn't talk about all of these as myths, one of the things is we did talk about planning, making sure that you've got a good change plan in place, making sure that you have the right sponsorship, integrating change early in a project. For any of you that work with the Project Management Institute, like 5 phases, or any other DMAIC, if you consider that as a project, being integrated early in the project is much better. If you come in the implementation stage, then it's very difficult to effectively have change for a project. And many times that's what happens, is projects will wait until the, late phase 3, early phase 4, where they are, they've been designing everything and then now they're about ready to implement, so, oh, now we need change. And the other thing to do is to really educate the team and others on change. So one of the things that I do as a change advisor is I go in for any project that I work on, and I have about an hour or 2 session that explains what change is, because there is so much confusion seemingly still in the marketplace around what change is about, because many people consider it to be more, and I know at the company where I am, They have a term called management of change, and then they have a term called change management that they changed to change leadership because it was very confusing for people. But you want to be sure that you educate others on what change you're actually talking about. And we're talking about the transition of people moving from an end of something, going through some kind of neutral period of time until new change is actually put in place. And it can be at an organizational level, as I mentioned, or it can be at a personal level. So one thing that I have found critically important is to develop those change plans and continually update them. I can't tell you how often we update change plans to make sure that the communication and the stakeholder engagement is fully updated and incorporates the right people. As people continue to shift roles and as people move in and out of projects, it's real important to make sure that you're engaging with the right people. Ensure that the sponsor's engaged, and not only with the project, but also with the people on the team. Get in on the project initiative early, and don't assume that other people actually understand change, which we just talked about. So I think it's about 10 till, and we're supposed to have time for some questions. So, Dawn, I'll turn it back to you to see if we have any questions.
Thank you very much again, Wanda, for your presentation. We really appreciate that. Please post your questions on the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. I should remind that you can find a recording of this webinar on ASQ Toronto section website as well as ASQ Toronto YouTube channel. I can see some questions have been posted. The first question is, how do you go about anchoring the change in the culture?
So the first thing would be to really understand the culture that you're in. There can be an assessment that you can do. If there's been an assessment of the culture for that organization already, then you can take a look at the results of that and determine, you know, what type of culture do they have? How participative is it? How much, how do people typically engage? What is some of the unwritten rules maybe of the game at that particular company? So the way you want to anchor your change in that is you would not want to go in, if the company is very casual, you would not want to go in with an extremely structured approach that told people that you had to do 1, 2, and 3. But what you would want to do would be to ask them questions to get them to give you the information that you need for 1, 2, and 3. So you want to adapt the change approach as you would with any other type work that you would be doing with a company to make sure that it's grounded in that culture. So develop your questions ahead of time and ask questions. If they're a very structured company and they work well with that, then you would want to go in with a specific structured approach to work with them so that they can see that things are actually being accomplished. The other thing is, how much change have they actually gone through before and how did it work for them? If you can get a feel for that. So one of the things that I do is I try to talk to some of the informal leaders in an organization to try to get a feel for what it's really like. One of the to ask them is how much change has been going on lately. Do you feel like you're overwhelmed with it, or, you know, are you guys kind of at a steady pace? Good time.
Thank you. The second question is 5 elements to sustain change is starting from clear direction. How reinforcement will be required if a clear direction provided?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat that.
Sure. 5 elements to sustain change is starting from clear direction. How reinforcement will be required if a clear direction provided?
If the clear direction is not provided, or it is provided?
It is provided.
It is provided? So if you've got clear direction, that's going to tell you like where you're trying to go and what your vision is for the project or whatever it is, or for the change that you're trying to make. So the reinforcement you're going to want to have is you want to reinforce those behaviors that are going to sustain the change. So based on the clear direction, based on the vision, if what you're wanting is for people to, measure certain aspects, then what you're going to do for reinforcement is you're going to ask questions around whatever that vision is. So if the vision is that they have a balanced set of measures that looks at process, results, and behaviors, then what you're going to do in terms of reinforcement is identify how can you actually do that. So you're going to say, all right, we're going to want to see those posted somewhere. Where are they going to be posted? How are they going to be posted? Is it online? Is it physical? Are they turned in? So some reinforcement like that. Other reinforcement can be that clear direction is that, Joe was the first to get there, and so we're going to give him a $25 gift card. Some places do things like that. That's a reinforcement. But you really want to look for those more intrinsic reinforcements, more than recognition, so to speak, so that you're reinforcing that behavior that you want to see. I know one example I can give you is there was an implementation for people to have certain diagrams located in one location, in one system. And so people were going to reviews and they were not pulling those from that particular file. And so it wasn't reinforced that, hey, you need to get this from the, the X system. So what happened is people kept going and getting the information wherever they could find it and use it that way. So that was poor reinforcement. But the vision is that everybody would store and use these diagrams from this one location. So the way to reinforce that would have been for people showing up to share those diagrams would have been, did you get this from the X system, kind of yes or no. If they didn't, then please come back when you get it from there. It takes behaviors on the part of the leaders as well as on the part of the people doing the change to reinforce that change. And so you've got to get agreement with your supervisors and your managers or whoever's providing that reinforcement. And that's sometimes tough to get, but you need that aligned so that it's clearly aligned that this is what we want to have happen and this is what we're going to reinforce as the behavior associated with it. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much. The third question is, what are the differences between change management and management of change?
Okay, so for me, the difference is, and you can look it up too, but my definition is change management has to do with people and the behaviors, so it's the people side of change. Management of change has to do with making specific changes to a project or the initiative itself. So, for example, if I was going to, if I have a project where I'm building a home and I wanted to change the specs on some aspect of the house, I would initiate a management of change to have the drawings redrawn and things changed that way. If it is change management, then it would be the people side, and it could be the people side of that change is that the house was being built and I thought that I was going to have these features and then all of a sudden I'm not. So how are you going to help me deal with the fact that now I'm not going to have what I thought I was? So it's about the personal side of the change and what's going on. And then that translates into an organizational change if it's an organizational change that's going on. So if you're restructuring an organization, it would be like helping people make that transition to they have a new title, they have a new boss, they have new coworkers. That would be the change from a people side. So that would be change management or change leadership. Management of change is going to deal with changing some physical aspect of a project or an initiative.
Thank you very much, Wanda. So I think that was all the questions that we had. And thank you very much all again for joining this webinar. And thank you very much, Wanda, for your presentation. Have a good night and goodbye.
Thank you very much.